emergency talks we heard have been held. It looks like the European Central Bank might be on the point of intervening in the bond market, buying those bonds from Italy and Spain that they failed to do last week. Might that work?
I hope so. I hope they have made that decision, and I hope that they communicate it clearly, because we've had a real lack of leadership, lack of communication, and frankly doing too little too late. I hope that this move, if it does happen, will calm the markets. But the question is, why didn't they do it sooner?
Well, Mark, Alistair Burt, the Foreign Office Minister, has admitted that Britain will feel the impact of events in the Eurozone, and that we do have limited ability to influence them. What do you think we can do? Just stand on the sidelines while the ECB try to get things going, or fail to get things going, as Emma's pointed out?
Well, I agree we shouldn't intrude on private grief in the Eurozone. I think one thing we can do is we can make contingency plans to help Ireland, were Ireland to request an orderly return to sterling. I think that's something this country could support Ireland with, subject to protection of UK depositors as against the European Central Bank. But overall, this isn't, our crisis. We warned the Eurozone against this, that essentially I wrote a book called The Euro Bad for Business back in 1998, and said that Italy and Spain cannot compete with Germany while sharing a currency. And it's all very well to talk about greater fiscal integration, or have these sort of conference calls of the ECB to buy a few Italian and Spanish bonds, but unless the Germans are prepared to take on Italy and Spain's debt, then it's difficult to see how the euro can sort of carry on like this.
Well, Emma, what about the position of Germany? I mean, can it forever bail out poorer countries?
Well, it's very difficult for Angela Merkel. She's obviously got a domestic electorate to worry about. She didn't do particularly well recently. Her party didn't do well in the recent regional elections. But I think she has to be more decisive, because in the longer term, if they do not sort this out, it will cost German taxpayers even more should the euro crumble and collapse. It would be very bad news for Germany and the rest of the 17 Eurozone countries. Mark might disagree.
Well, he's shaking
his head. But
the most costly thing for Germany would be to take on Spain and Italy's debts in the name of European integration.
Germany's debt to GDP ratio is higher than Spain's. Admittedly, Italy's is much higher than Germany's, but their economies can recover and will recover. I worry more about Greece. Greece's economy isn't very resilient at all, and the problem with the euro was it was a political project from the outset, and they didn't take care enough to look at who was abiding by the rules and whether they should have been let in the first place. Greece has been running a debt to GDP ratio of over 100% since the early 90s. That should have set off alarm bells.
Is this the moment then to let some countries like Greece fall out of the Eurozone altogether? Is it perhaps the moment, as some commentators have said, to have two different types of currencies in Europe?
And what we've seen, I think, really over the last week is we've begun to see the markets price for a euro breakup. It's Italy that's been hit harder. Spain had previously had a greater problem, but now Italy and Spain are almost trading together, and the yields went up much more for the shorter dated debt than the longer dated debt, which suggests that the markets are pricing for an increasing chance of a euro breakup and perhaps a new lira and new peseta. And if you look at Italy, unlike Greece, as Emma says, most of the debt is domestic, and Italian households may well prefer to see Italy leaving the euro and at least being paid back in new lira than they will to having a restructuring and having one of these great haircuts imposed on the electorate in Italy. And what we also saw last week is the German yield sort of falling, German bonds rallying strongly, which you wouldn't expect to see if there was the prospect of euro bonds or great fiscal integration in Europe. If that was going to happen, you'd see German bonds selling off, but the fact that they were rallying is suggesting the markets are seeing an increasing chance for euro breakup, and perhaps sooner rather than later.
Is this a lack of leadership, Emma? And what about Gordon Brown's point that this needs a radical restructuring of Europe's banks and the euro, and will almost certainly, he says, require intervention by the G20 and the International Monetary Fund?
Well, I agreed with him in his piece that the European Financial Stabilisation Fund needs expanding, and I agree with him that there has been poor leadership. We had a deal on the 21st of July. It didn't go far enough. It wasn't quick enough. That decision could have been taken weeks, if not months ago. There has been very, very poor leadership, but part of the reason, and come back to Angela Merkel, she's really the key to this, is because she cannot decide which is more important, the domestic electorate short-term pressing problems or the longer-term problems of the euro crumbling. And I disagree with Mark in that I don't think the third largest eurozone country could drop out of the euro without the euro crumbling entirely, and I just don't think they're going to let that happen.
Well, Mark, you were making the point, let's not intrude on private grief, which is a fine comment to make, but the EU is the UK's biggest export market for manufactured goods. We do get tied up into any crisis within the Eurozone, even though we're not part of it. What about Nick Clegg saying we can't just crow from the sidelines? That was effectively his message to Conservative backbenchers, sceptics like yourself, who perhaps are quite happy to let Europe get on with it.
Well, I mean, I'm not crowing from the sidelines. I'd like to see, as I think all of us would, to see sort of growth and stronger performance in key trading partners. But the problem is the euro, which has led to this enormous instability. The stock market's down a quarter since the euro was created. It's led to low growth. It's driven European economies apart rather than bring them together, as some of us predicted. But what we want to see is a return to growth in Europe, and the best way to do that is to re-establish national currencies, to have interest rates set to the needs of the individual countries, to allow Spain and Italy to devalue, to sort of price their exporters back into world markets. And it's only when we start seeing that happen, and the sooner the better, that we'll get growth back. The euro is leading to all these problems and huge instability. What we need is national currencies back.
Big question for you now, though. What about your personal views on Europe and the UK's relation to Europe? I mean, you would describe yourself as a sceptic, presumably. What kind of sceptic are you? Would you like to leave Europe completely?
Well, I would like Britain to be an independent country, sort of, trading with Europe.
So you would like to leave the EU?
Well, I would like a relationship rather more like that Norway and Switzerland has. And it may be that if we do see this greater integration of the Eurozone and that works, which, I'm doubtful about, but were that to happen, then I think it's really a question of the UK, rather like, say, Switzerland or Norway. What sort of relationship do we want with that emerging sort of fiscal union around the Eurozone? And I hope it will be a much looser arrangement where we make our own decisions and govern ourselves, but maintain sort of free trade and appropriate bilateral cooperation.
Well, Emma, you've worked very closely in Europe. You worked for the European Socialists and then as a special advisor to Jeff Hoon, so presumably you like the idea of staying in Europe.
Certainly do.
But what is Labour's policy now? Because in office you did sign up to a number of treaties which took powers away from Westminster. Do you, as a party, regret that now?
No, I think overall we are pragmatic and pro-European. There are obviously a few MPs who are not, but then you've even got pro-Europeans in the Conservative Party, so that the exception doesn't prove the rule. Overall, we're pro-European. I think that in a world where power is shifting south and east to countries the size and scale of India, Brazil, China, it would be absolute madness to think that the UK could go it alone, especially when it comes to negotiating free trade agreements, especially when it comes to the internal market, the largest internal market in the world, that is the EU.
And what about when British businesses complain about their hands being tied by European regulations?
It depends on the nature of the regulation. If it is poor regulation, then that's obviously bad for business. But if you replace 27 sets of regulation with one regulation which allows you to trade across borders, that's actually deregulatory regulation, believe it or not.
Well, Mark, enthusiasm here, it's not infectious, I can see. I mean, you're not buying this argument. Would you like to have, then, some sort of referendum? Would you like to have a question put to the British people saying, should we stay in or out?
Yes, I would, and I just think it's, whatever your view, and sort of, I hope Emma and people in the Labour Party would support that. I mean, even if you want to make a pro-European case, surely in a democracy we can only remain part of the EU if that is the settled wish of the the British people, and we're now seeing opinion polls showing 2 to 1 the British people wanting to come out of the EU, and very, very strong support for having a referendum. And I've never had a chance to vote on this. No one under the age of 54 has. And back in 1975 we were told it was common market, nothing like what it's become. And if you watch these European politicians and the bankers and just their inability to manage the euro or to understand markets, and they've inflicted this extraordinary experiment on their people, which has just completely failed. Do we really want to be governed by these people?
Well, Emma, in our last few seconds, do you think that people like Mark should be given their referendum?
Well, firstly, I don't think we're governed by the European Union. We have a very strong parliament which we are members of. I think there are more pressing economic issues that we need to look at rather than having a referendum on our membership of the European Union.
Emma, Mark, thank you very much indeed. Now for Labour, it's the big